afternoon and welcome to From Looking to Voyeurism. I'm Francis Levy. Ed Recessian and I are co-directors of the Philoctetes Center. And before we get this afternoon's program on moving on, I wanted to call your attention to the exhibition of paintings, drawings, and prints. In fact, there's a quilt inside by Katie Commodore, which is made up of sadomasochistic images. These are all kinds of varieties of exposition in the graphic form of some of the themes that we have dealt with in this six-part series on sexuality. This is the fifth of 6 parts. Next week is paraphilias. All Philoctetes discussions and roundtables are archived. So you simply go to philoctetes.org. People constantly come up to me and say, how can I see them? Or they are all, we record everything. There's a 3-camera setup here. So you go to philoctetes.org and you go simply to the archive. And by 2 or 3 days after the event, you can see it. Now, we also simulcast. So today's event is being simulcast and people around the world see it. So I'm now pleased to introduce Dany Nobus. Dany Nobus is Chair of Psychology and Psychoanalysis and Head of the School of Social Sciences at Brunel University, London, where he also directs the MA program in Psychoanalysis and Contemporary Society. He is the author most recently of Knowing Nothing, Staying Stupid, Elements for a Psychoanalytic Epistemology. And Dr. Nobus will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce our other distinguished guests. And also, some of his books and books by the other panelists are on sale after the roundtable. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Well, let me first of all thank the Philoctetes Center and Edna Assessi and Francis Levi for making this possible and for bringing together such an eminent multidisciplinary group of panelists here, which should make for a very lively discussion, I think. I should say that one of the original panelists, Stephen Porge, couldn't make it today, but we're very lucky to have Saul Robbins here as a panelist. Let me introduce the panelists in turn. We have today Marianne Doane, who is the George Hazard Croker Professor of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University. She's the author of The Emergence of Cinematic Time, Modernity, Contingency, the Archive, Femme Fatale, Feminism, Film Theory, Psychoanalysis, and The Desire to Desire, the woman's film of the 1940s. In addition, Marianne has published a wide range of articles on feminist film theory, sound in the cinema, cyclitic theory, television, and sexual and racial difference in film. Then we have Katherine Frank. Katherine is a cultural anthropologist currently studying the meaning and negotiation of sexual exclusivity in contemporary relationships. In addition to her work on monogamy, she has also written on the sex industry, pornography, feminism, eating disorders, and reality television. She's the author of G-Strings and Sympathy, Strip Club Regulars and Male Desire, and the co-editor of Flesh for Fantasy, Producing and Consuming Exotic Dance. Then we have Saul Robbins. Saul is a photographer interested in the ways in which people move through, relate to, and occupy their surroundings, especially the intersection of private and public experience in the urban environment. His photography has been exhibited internationally and published in the New York Times, TAM, the CPW Photography Quarterly, Ziek, Wired, Aufbau, and a spate of other journals. He has work in the collections of Alliance Capital, Hunter College, and Oregon's Portland Museum of Art, among others. Saul was the curator of Regarding Intimacy at the Karl and Bertha Leubsdorff Gallery at Hunter College, and the co-curator of No Live Girls, an installation of artists' videos at the Lusty Lady in San Francisco and Seattle. In 1998, Saul was awarded an NICA stipendium to study on exchange at Berlin's Hochschule der Künste. And then finally, we have Sarah Stanbury, who is a professor of English at the College of the Holy Cross. She has written on space and embodiment in 14th century texts, as well as on ocular rapture in medieval religious writings and contemporary film. Sarah is the author of Seeing the Gawain Poet, Description and the Act of Perception, and most recently, The Visual Object of Desire in Late Medieval England. Now, we are here today to discuss, or indeed if you want to look at, The distinction, the difference between looking and voyeurism as part of a series of 6 roundtables on the biology and psychology of sexuality. When I saw the title for the first time, I thought it was interesting how it suggested a direction. The title is From Looking to Voyeurism, which seems to suggest that you start with looking, and at some point your looking becomes voyeurism, which raises the question as to the cutoff point, as to the criterion that one would use to distinguish between the two. Is it a quantitative criterion? Is it a qualitative criterion? It reminded me also of what Otto Fennekel said in a seminal paper of 1935 dealing with the scoptophilic instinct, in which Fennekel suggested that looking becomes voyeurism when a certain intensity of looking can be seen or can be looked at as an indication of sexual enjoyment. So there is definitely in that spectrum an element of sexual enjoyment that we will need to discuss as a criterion for differentiating between the two. Now, just to open the debate, I'd like to start with something that Freud wrote in the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality in the context of an admittedly brief discussion of touching and looking. Freud, and it's not really an argument, it's a statement, it's an assertion rather than an argument. Freud writes, visual impressions remain the most frequent pathway along which libidinal excitation is aroused. Indeed, natural selection counts upon the accessibility of this pathway when it encourages the development of beauty in the sexual object. Marianne, do you agree?
There's an awful lot there, and I'm actually kind of stuck on the title of the panel itself, From Looking to Voyeurism, and the idea of whether or not there's a cutoff between looking and voyeurism, and the conjunction of that with the quote from Freud from 3 essays on the theory of sexuality is very interesting, because if Freud named the panel, it would have to be From Voyeurism to Looking, because sexuality in that book is really, what we consider to be adult sexuality is a function of a kind of repression of polymorphous perversion in the infant. So perversion is there from the beginning and is only contained gradually by social and psychical structures. So you would begin with perverse looking, in a sense, or voyeurism, and then move to looking. And the idea that beauty is a consequence of natural selection is quite amazing, of course, but and clearly not true. Otherwise we would all be beautiful. But the question, of course, is what constitutes beauty, and it's reminiscent for me of Roland Barthes' notion of beauty, and as said, where beauty is always a copy of a copy of a copy. In other words, it's representational. It's a function of a history, an aesthetic history, what constitutes beauty within a particular cultural era, and is exactly the opposite, in fact, of the biological or natural.
So you would partly agree with Freud in as much as that you would agree with his point that the visual impressions are fundamental, but in a sense also make all of us into voyeurs.
Yes.
But you would disagree with his Darwinian or pseudo-Darwinian take on things, that that beauty, especially when it's attached to the sexual object, is something that facilitates that type of voyeurism.
Well, to some extent I disagree with the idea that looking, it's interesting that this is in the context of a discussion of looking versus touching, because touching, of course, is a sense, at a contact sense, and looking always implies distance. And I think that to a large extent, particularly in my field, which is film studies, the centrality of looking, the centrality of visuality is also very much a function of modernity and postmodernity. In other words, the fact that we're surrounded by visual images. And that voyeurism in particular is kind of fundamental to the classical notion of going to the movies and watching a film, because you're in a dark theater, you're alone, and it's a distance, it's a sense at a distance. You don't have contact, you don't have touch, and that's one of the things that's excluded completely from the cinema. So I don't think that it's entirely explicable in terms of biological or even psychical notions that looking would be, the pathway for the most libidinal excitation. But it's interesting that Freud thought so, at the turn of the century.
Katherine, as a cultural anthropologist, you've done research on men attending strip clubs. Is beauty in the eye of the beholder?
Well, yeah, I was interested in those comments. One of the things I should just mention about the research, one of the things I did, I wanted to look at the regular customer, so the men who returned again and again, and for whom it was a really significant personal practice. And part of the way I did that is to work at clubs that were distinguished by levels of classiness. So I actually worked as a dancer. Being an anthropologist, I did participant observation. I worked from the nicest clubs in the city to the worst, the dive bars. And I wanted to compare some of the motivations of the customers. And one of the things that came up frequently in their conversations, men would say, I would ask the customers, well, why do you go? The first answer, to look at beautiful women. But at the same time, then once you start unpacking those statements, beauty's not necessarily what's inciting desire in those spaces. I mean, first of all, beauty's created by the spaces that the customers inhabit. So through the lighting, through the setups of the different clubs, through the customer expectation and pre-existing ideas about what the clubs would offer. And also in relation to their wives and partners. So a lot of the customers, especially the regular customers, were looking for something different from their wife or girlfriend or partner. And so what becomes erotic then and incites the actual desire is not a sanitized beauty, but sort of those little spaces of the obscene. So beauty in the sex industry is kind of a flexible idea, I suppose.
Flexible.
Does that make sense? Flexible in that...
In a literal sense?
Well, I think of a better way to say that. It's created, but it's not, and it's certainly expressed as a motivation for being in that space and as a motivation for spending your money for this type of entertainment. But what makes something, there are men who desired to look at, say, what they called a model-type dancer, a perfected, perhaps having breast implants, dyed hair, a lot of makeup, elaborate costuming. There were other men who desired the girl next door, the girl with an imperfection, who was wearing the wrong kind of shoes or had oily skin or something, some small little imperfection that sort of let them access what they believed to be beyond her objective appearance, her subjectivity. And there was also the fact that many of the customers for whom this is a really eroticized space saw the female body as somewhat obscene. It wasn't an everyday experience to be looking at a nude female. So there was fear there. There was apprehension and excitement.
What is obscene? I wasn't sure what you meant. I mean, I know what the word means. What do you mean by obscene in this context?
It differed depending on the person's psychology and erotic patterns, I think. So.
But in that situation of the strip club, the female body is deliberately exposed, and you could say exhibited, for the purposes of inducing sexual gratification in the customer. Now, traditionally, we would see the voyeur as someone who adopts a position, and it's generally a male position, where he himself is not seen, but watches something that isn't supposed to be watched. I guess what I'm trying to say is that can we restrict the position of the voyeur to something for which he himself is responsible, or should we open it up to all kinds of situations in which someone derives sexual gratification?
Do you mean gratification or do you mean excitement?
Well, I mean, we can talk about that type of difference of excitement and gratification. I mean, let's just stick to Freud's idea here of libidinal arousal, let's say. So the question for me is, should we restrict the position of the voyeur to how we have traditionally seen that position, as someone who watches what isn't supposed to be watched or seen, or can we open it up to those kinds of settings where the female body, or indeed anything, is presented, is deliberately exposed for the gratification or the excitement of the male gaze?
Well, there is a difference for Freud between scopophilia, the desire to look, and voyeurism. And there's a pleasure in looking, scopophilia, which is also a kind of desire for knowledge. It's kind of epistemophilia as well. And voyeurism always has the connotation of illegality, something that's illicit. And I think my sense of what Katherine is pointing to is that part of the excitement, the libidinal excitement or otherwise of the strip club, is that it's on this margin between the legal and the illegal and the illicit. It's not completely socially acceptable to go to these places, to perform in these places, etc. And that is essential to the pleasure. Now the question, of course, is whether it's voyeurism because it's so public and it's not a kind of peephole thing, and men can be seen by other men there. They're not, behind a curtain or looking through a peephole. So I don't know. It's a question of the extent to which this is a social kind of spectatorship, isolated, and maybe it's that for some men and not for others.
I've always resisted using that word to describe customers as voyeuristic. I think it's because the relations of looking are really complicated, because it's also labor relations. It's gendered relations of looking, and then also labor relations in a workplace. So, yeah, I think that's a good point.
I guess I might jump in there to ask if that experience of looking, even if it's in a public space and seems to be legitimate, because there are other people who are participating in that looking, you might say, even if it's a sort of marginal strip club, but you're sharing that experience with a lot of others, so therefore it legitimizes it. But if it's your own private experience in some way that voyeurism can become very private even within the context of a public space, I think, or the experience of looking, because it's one's own psychological moment. So therefore you have your own, the knowledge that you're pursuing something in your own private way that's different, and therefore potentially isolates you. I guess it's that isolation that comes from knowing that you're separate that might create that or turn that into a voyeuristic experience.
Now, Sarah, you've written on medieval English literature, judging by your publications. Is Peeping Tom the quintessential icon of the voyeur?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Sort of looking through the peephole. that becomes it. I actually got interested in questions of voyeurism and the gaze some time ago, sort of thinking how in medieval texts, in English literature, how do people look at each other? How do women look at men? What are the ways that that's represented? And it quickly became, it seemed like that those things, though, become religious. That so many descriptions or accounts of looking in medieval texts get co-opted or turn into religious looking. And so many of the ways that we talk about looking in medieval texts, or even very eroticized looking and pleasurable looking, are represented in medieval Christianity in the structure, even in the structure of ritual. So, for instance, seeing the Mass is in many ways the elevation of the Eucharistic host during the Mass is orchestrated as a kind of voyeuristic moment. With a revelatory thing that you see, which is this object that's food, and it's almost like female sexuality in itself, this big round
edible object, the large Eucharistic wafer. And there are many, many occasions for that kind of seeing, of looking at the body, looking at this mutilated body of Christ on the cross. That's, weirdly pleasurable in many descriptions of it. That's even orchestrated during the Mass. So that's, veiled. The body is veiled and then it's exposed, on Easter, and you see it in this kind of moment of revelation. Even in the structure of medieval churches, there were often little peepholes within the screens, separating the congregation from the chancel, where people could look and see, so you can get a bird's eye view of what's going on up there that's separated from you. So there are all sorts of, really sort of bizarre ways, I think, and complicated ways that Christianity kind of created its own spectacle around a quasi-eroticized set of rituals.
The confession also.
Yes, the confession. Yes, the confession itself, which is, but that becomes actually, it's really a post-medieval structure where you have the little confessional booth. The booth, where it's really creating within the space of, say, the cathedral or the church, this private structure, where you're separated. Because during the 14th and 15th century, the confession would just take place in the open between the individual and the priest. But so there was a move in that even to make that more private. So therefore, it kind of ratchets up the relationship of what's being confessed and the power of the priest, I think, in that private dynamic. So there is a kind of pleasure, and of course, most of the time, what you're confessing would be sexual sins.
No.
I mean, you can confess, well, I ate too much.
It's very interesting, and it does bring us back to, I think, a point I was trying to make earlier about the relationship between the subject and the object in voyeurism. I mean, you say that the spectacle of Christianity, the way in which religious symbols are presented in Christianity, somehow invites or facilitates or stimulates a certain form of voyeurism, which again means that voyeurism is not just a subjective position, it's a relationship between the subject and an object, and that something about the object in itself, which is an intrinsic part of the relationship, can actually make or break the voyeur.
And it's also something that can be orchestrated,
right,
and can be used for sort of very intentionally in building up that relationship, or in organizing, you might say, dynamics of power between the object that's viewed and the person that's viewing it, so that, I mean, in a lot of medieval 14th, 15th century European ritual, this is pre-Reformation, and perhaps the Reformation came about because of the power of the church, had finally orchestrated its rituals so well that there was a kind of public demand for access, for more direct access to what was being held and controlled and organized privately. So, I mean, I think that, yes, it's sort of a conscious structure.
Right.
Between building pleasure, or how you're going to represent the object in such a way that it becomes an increasingly desired object.
Let me go to Saul. Saul, you're a photographer, so I guess my first question is photography a culturally sanctioned form of voyeurism? As a photographer, you construct an object, but would you say that the object also constructs you? And to what extent does voyeurism enters that equation?
I think that photography is definitely a voyeuristic avocation. The nature of looking through a camera, pointing it at something, objectifying your subject matter is definitely very much like sort of a voyeuristic gaze. For me, it has less to do with sexuality usually, but if I look at mass culture, we live in sort of almost like an abundancy, a sexual abundancy of images in a way. There's such a crossover between titillation through sort of commerce and trying to rub as close against to sexual stimulation as possible in order to sell things, that the photography has become more and more related to voyeurism in that sense. It's like at least in commercial photography, it's very much about creating this sort of mass archive of imagery that's out there to stimulate us 24/7. For my own work, some of the work I do is definitely voyeuristic, but it's more in the sort of layman's term rather than putting it within a sexual context or a libidinal or even physical context.
You don't derive sexual gratification from your work?
No, not usually. I reserve that for other areas of my life, like most people. But I think that to expand upon the idea of voyeurism for most photographers is to look at is to objectify experience or subject and to be deriving some sort of pleasure and stimulation, though not necessarily sexual, from the appreciation, from the chance to look at that object or that subject in a way that allows us continual observation without being afraid of being found out or outed, let's say, or the bar is closed or whatever it might be.
Do you want to respond to that?
Well, yeah, I was thinking on that, and then what Mary and Dunn was saying a moment ago. From a sociological perspective, I mean, I don't come at this trained as an analyst at all, but more as a sociologist, and I think that what I tend to see in relations of looking overall is power relations that we're talking about. And so when the decision is made, which kinds of looking are pathological, right? I mean, so in feminist theory, there was the theories of the male gaze for years, right? That the male gaze was somehow, that power relation was working in one direction, and women were being seen by men, and that was a form of domination, right? Also in sociology, there was the tourist gaze, where the privileged, wealthy tourists are gazing upon the natives of a place, right? And so that power is unidirectional that way, and there's domination going on. But some of that work has become really complicated with the gazes are multi-directional. Someone's always looking back at you. And so those lines in terms of where it's pathologized and where we're just using it as a cultural term, I think are, or a more layman's term, how you said it, is an important issue to take up, right?
Yeah, I think in a way we're all voyeurs. Whether we derive libidinal stimulation from looking at something or if it just satisfies our interest. I was thinking this morning and writing down a bunch of different photographers, just sort of thinking about who, if I needed to make a reference. And I realized that it's less about what his or her subject is, but the subject in general. Like Susan Meiselas has this work right now at the International Center of Photography where I teach and work. And there's three different projects that she has. One is Carnival Strippers, which was her spending about 3 summers around these carnival strippers along the East Coast, from Vermont down to North or South Carolina, and photographing the women, becoming friendly with them, documenting their relationship to the barkers and the managers, and to, of course, the audience, and also making audio recordings of all these interviews and the sort of the audio goings-on in and out of the midway, so to speak. Another project she did was Nicaragua, which is a very, very important project where she went down to Nicaragua during the Sandinistas' attempt to overthrow Somoza. And then another project was this Kurdistan project where she went into the Kurdish area of northern Iraq in the early 1990s as Saddam Hussein was attacking the Kurdish people. And instead of following them as they left, she stayed there. And she found that the people that she was meeting and photographing continually had small photographs of their families and friends and literally of their family history, and that holding these objects, these photographs, was considered to be a treasonous act and could be easily grounds for punishment, imprisonment, possibly even death. But when we go to look at either any of these 3 exhibits, it's so outside of my realm of experience. The closest actually that I could get to would be carnival strippers, just because that's something that I could access in this country.
Right.
But it's still very much a voyeuristic experience of looking at photographs of, obviously a war-torn region is something that I wouldn't gain titillation from, but I would have a sort of a strange desire satisfied by looking at something that's very far from me and possibly unacceptable and very sort of outside of the realm of acceptable experience, but I could still allow myself the pleasure, so to speak, of looking at it. And I think that's something I thought about when you were talking, that if we're in this space and enjoying the dancing of the woman, or it could be the man, there is this strange sense of community that we're in, and at the same time very much a sense of, I would imagine, extreme separation from the other men or women in that space, because of the fact that in a way it is such a counterculture or unacceptable, and especially in the last 10 or 15 years, sort of a derogatory experience, that we're not allowed to assume the pure enjoyment of sexuality. We're not allowed to see women within that industry in a true egalitarian and feminist, very pro-feminist way. So it's very layered, and the power dynamics are very complex.
Right.
I think
Let me go back
some of the pathology of voyeurism has to do with the necessity for the voyeur of not being seen him or herself, of being hidden. There isn't a reciprocity of looking in that relationship between the voyeur and the exhibitionist. Even though the exhibitionist may need the voyeur may need the exhibitionist. There's a kind of dissociation between the two. And I think with strip clubs and what they have in common perhaps with photojournalism is that it's a space of looking that doesn't entail risk on the part of the voyeur. There's a kind of pleasure in that looking because you're not implicated, or you don't have to be implicated yourself. The ephemerality of the encounters in the strip club, for instance, and the ephemerality of encounters in photojournalism in different countries. And so I think those two forms of, if you could call them voyeurism, have a lot of interesting links to each other. And they're around this question of, the hiddenness of the voyeur and the fact that it's a risk-free position to assume.
I wanted to ask something, though, because Katherine, you mentioned, the male gaze and work on that as being something from the past. When people were working on that, and it's true. I mean, that there was this real interest in the 90s of work, in the 80s of trying to understand how gender worked. Maybe even the 70s, how looking was gendered, and it was very exciting work. And you did much of this work, Marianne, yourself. And where do women come in on this? If looking is such a masculine activity, or voyeurism is we associate it so much with men, and then if women are the ones who were in the position of those who were looking, what happens? And it's fascinating to me that this is sort of a dialogue that we might put in the past, because it does seem like it still should be going on, though I think in most criticism it seems to be people have moved beyond it, sort of weirdly.
Well, I think complicated it. Maybe.
Or complicated it such that you can't really use those terms. We can't use those terms anymore, or.
Well, I think it was actually very complex to begin with, and that many people, in thinking that we've gone beyond it, that entails a kind of simplification of the theory, which is usually associated with Laura Mulvey's very famous article on visual pleasure and narrative cinema. And I think that essay had an incredible impact. People still wrestle with it, still quote it, although we all claim we've gone beyond it. It's still there as this incredible force to contend with. And I think the reason is that she shifted the emphasis in terms of, feminist analyses of cinema away from the idea of images of women, being positive or negative, and that kind of assessment, to one that was very specifically about the cinema and about visuality and seeing, And what she did was to take the cinema and look at it as a structure of vision, a way of structuring vision, a way of structuring looking in pleasurable ways that were problematic for the woman. Mm-hmm. And so while it is true that in the kind of binary opposition that she adopted of male active, woman passive, or male agent, woman bearer of meaning, that kind of thing, there is this sort of haunting binary, strict, rigid, binary opposition. It was complicated by the fact that the man in that paradigm was never really in control. And you think about the examples that people tended to drift toward during that time, which were primarily drawn from Hitchcock, because Hitchcock was so aware of the intensity of looking and the importance of looking in the cinema. But if you think about Rear Window or Vertigo, the Jimmy Stewart character in those films, and in Laura Mulvey's theory of those films, it's not a position of complete control, power, or coherency. It's riddled with anxiety, and the move to image the woman in a particular kind of way is always defensive against the anxiety that's produced.
So would you say it's actually an eroticization of anxiety that happens? Or is the anxiety something that interferes with the visual pleasure?
Well, I think that the anxiety, in Laura Mulvey's essay, it's a kind of castration anxiety, which is a function of the look at the woman. Okay, so the woman is threatening. The threat of the woman is that she signifies at some level castration for the male spectator. And therefore, to make that, to spectacularize that object, to make her bear the sort of brunt of the look, as it were, to freeze her in time and spectacle is one way of countering that. And to punish her at the level of the plot would be another way of countering that anxiety. So it's a kind of circular movement. The look at the woman causes anxiety, the look at the woman then quells that anxiety or allays it.
It's interesting in Rear Window, I was just reading, Aperture had profiled some photographs, stills from that movie, but the Jimmy Stewart character, he's got all this photographic equipment and never actually uses it to make a picture. And so there's this incredible parallel with the titillation of the voyeur, of looking at something and not being able to take it to its final sexual satisfaction, which then, of course, also plays out for the audience who's watching this and the anxiety of will the camera be used or not, and again, that not being sort of fulfilled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the camera is used as a telephoto lens to be able to see better.
Exactly.
And he, in fact, is in a wheelchair with a broken leg. And his girlfriend, Grace Kelly, does not become of interest to him until she moves into the area of the image itself.
Yeah,
that's right.
And even his sort of confrontation with the Raymond Burr, the character who's the suspect, when he comes into the apartment, he's stopped momentarily by flash bulbs, which are blinding him, which is sort of like the orgastic sort of outcome of the use of the camera in a way that's puts something at bay for a little bit.
I can see that there are already some questions from the audience, but I suggest that we carry on with the discussion for perhaps another 10 minutes, because I feel that we're touching upon some very fundamental points here with regard to the gendering of the gaze and how it affects this whole dynamics of looking and voyeurism. Ed?
I want to make a couple of points. First, I think in terms of the three essays in Freud, Freud came to psychoanalysis, or he discovered psychoanalysis, from a clinical perspective. And so it is no doubt that he talks about sexuality, because this is what he saw in the patients, the hysterical patients, because the sexuality he felt was what lied, the repressed sexuality was what lied behind the symptoms. But today, I think one would have to look at it from a different perspective, which is that there are certain functions or properties that are part and parcel of a functioning person and a brain, and looking is a very, very significant aspect of that. And I think the reference to Darwin in a way alludes to that. It is important to look. You cannot In fact, it's harder to stop yourself from looking than looking. Any research done to prevent people, don't look this way, immediately everybody wants to look. So looking, I think, is more fundamental and basic than later developments of it, which get it mixed up with sexuality, which then possibly can lead to voyeurism. I think Dany was going in that direction, prefer a narrower definition of voyeurism. I don't think people who go to strip clubs, if you go to a strip club once or twice, I'm just throwing a number, doesn't make you a voyeur. The pleasure in seeing women naked is not voyeuristic. In fact, it's important in the sexual interaction that the man enjoy to see his wife or his girlfriend naked, enjoy the body. So I think that's part of the way we are in relationships. And women like to be looked at, and men like to look.
And
vice versa?
I think not as much. I think women don't find looking at men or looking at men naked as arousing as men find looking at women naked, which is why there are many more. Well, I think it has to do with
these days women do go to strip clubs.
Yeah,
as
but
well.
there are no. If you think
Women
about,
have much less disposable income to spend in those places.
Okay, hold that thought. We'll come back to that.
I don't think it's only a question of income. I think it's a question of biology, and I think it's a question of the reasons for one as versus the other. The man has to get the woman pregnant in order to continue the species, and the woman has to get pregnant, and so she's looking at things. My patients, I know a lot more about what their wives look like than I know about what their husbands look like. Women often, the only thing I hear about the husband is that I'm worried about him because he's getting too fat. But because of this, I think
But perhaps men don't want to be looked at because it feminizes them. It reduces their idea of what it means.
I think men would love to be looked at. Women just don't look at them as much.
I would agree. Totally.
And I have had this conversation before.
And you don't think we should try to change that?
I don't think we can change it.
Oh, you think we can
try.
change it?
I mean, men try. They go build their bodies and they do all sorts of things to attract the attention of women. It doesn't usually work, and it's very hard to know what it is that a woman finds attractive in a man. But leaving that aside, I think the question becomes...
Spoken as a male, of course.
Yes. The question becomes, at which point is the person who is going to the strip club is a voyeur? Because otherwise every man who goes to a strip club would be considered having a disorder, which is voyeurism. And I don't think... I think it's a question of what is going on through the mind of the person. And it is a question of the degree of compulsion. If you have to go every day or every week and it's the only way you get sexually aroused, if you have to go every week or every month and then masturbate and then leave your wife and never have sex with her, those are indications of the possible pathology. In my view also, because I have increasingly become convinced that violent, angry, aggressive fantasies, devaluating fantasies play an important role in the perversions. I think the men who are most voyeur are the ones who go to the strip clubs with the idea of seeing a devalued woman, not a valued woman. It's a woman who in their mind is, borderline obscene, as you said. One last thing I would like to say is that I think anxiety leads to it. Not that anxiety is secondary to it. I think anxiety leads to the compulsion to keep looking at the naked woman.
I have a question. The idea that devalued woman, first off, it's such a obviously subjective terminology, but in that relation between that and anxiety and voyeurism and aggression, I don't know if there's been studies looking at men's emotional sort of, their responses, but it seems like so much of it is about they devalue the woman, or the woman has to be devalued enough for them to feel good about themselves going to this place, which has such a stigma within our society, doing something in that place, which is so often stigmatized, and trying to feel better about themselves, and sort of maintaining, in a sense, a traditional gendered power dynamic, which is very unequal.
Yes.
But surely there it is in the voyeuristic gaze that the object is being devalued. It is not something about the object in itself that is devalued, I think. Well, what you're trying to say is that the voyeur, in engaging, devalues in doing what he does, and the devaluation of the object therefore lies in what the voyeur does rather than in what the object presents, right? No?
I'm not sure I would put it that way.
Right.
Could I really have to challenge this idea of this biologism of sexual difference in and around looking and beauty in particular, I think. What constitutes beauty, it's not biological by any means. I mean, it changes from culture to culture. We know that. So it's not there. I mean, it's not out there. It's not a property of the object. And in the West, we have a long history of representation of the nude female body, which feeds into all of this. We have ways of constituting looking in terms of sexual difference. And we are all born into that system, and we confront it each in our own ways, but we still align ourselves in some way with it. So I think that, to say that women don't, men like to look at women and women don't like to look at men, it seems to me to be very problematic from the point of view of sexual politics of looking and of feminism. Because it makes this a biological, essential, ahistorical category that could never be changed. And I think that is really part of the problem, to see it as something that is ahistorical and unchangeable, biological, hardwired, whatever you want to call it. I enjoy looking a lot. I mean, I love to look at both naked men and naked women, anything. And I find myself staring a lot. Sorry?
I wasn't claiming that. I made the point, but I didn't mean it's so black and white. Obviously, everyone has to enjoy looking. You must enjoy looking. I was just saying, in general, it seems to me that men prefer to look at women more than women want to look at men naked. I'm not saying any other way. But I don't think voyeurism and beauty have anything to do with each other.
That may be the case.
Sarah,
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking that you're identifying voyeurism as a pathology. You're specifically seeing voyeurism as a kind of psychological pathology. And there's so many ways that voyeurism, there are gray areas of experiences that are organized voyeuristically in fascinating ways that culture has. I think that maybe what we've been talking about here a lot is the way that societies have had uses for that marginal pathology to orchestrate desire in pleasurable ways and economic ways and powerful ways, so that we have many experiences such as, in my work, religion, even organized Christianity, that channels desire through very common pathways. I looked at a couple of years ago this film by Mel Gibson, The Passion of the Christ.
Yeah.
There was a lot of controversy around it at that time. And one of the things that was so interesting in that film is that here you have, I mean, it's sort of reversing visual structures that we've been talking about, or gendered structures, because the object of the gaze is a man. And that's very typical for Christianity. You know, that medieval Christianity didn't really have a female nude at all, or medieval culture. In Western Europe, the only nude was the body of Christ, oddly. And you see this in Mel Gibson's movie, and he uses it so powerfully, or strategically in a sense, that the gaze becomes focused on this increasingly suffering body, which is weird. That becomes weirdly erotic, I think, and sadistic and masochistic. And then suffering is channeled through the gaze of the mother, who's played by Maya Morgenstern in that film, the Virgin, who, she's called the Virgin, whatever, she's his mother. And she's always looking at him. You always are seeing her in the film looking at him, and she doesn't say anything, it's just this suffering gaze. So you're the gaze of the audience in this sort of voyeuristic movie space is looking at a woman looking at a man. So it's reversing a lot of expectations, we might say, for how the gaze in cinema works.
But the man is violent.
That raises an interesting issue about the position of the spectator who watches movies. And I remember seeing that movie. And it was difficult to watch, but I saw it. And it was difficult to watch because, not just because of the drama or the spectacle or the actual imagery, but because it made me think as to why I wanted to watch this to the end, and so it made me think about my own enjoyment in a sense, I mean, you've written on film, so the spectator who watches the film.
Well, that brings up a lot of different questions, but voyeurism has been a very important category in film theory, precisely because when you go into a movie theater, you're in, an audience, but on the other hand, you're alone. You're in the dark, you're looking directly ahead of you, for the entire film. The film is for you in some sense, not for anyone else in the theater. It's just for you. In Hollywood, for a very long time, and to a large extent this is still true, it is taboo for the actors or actresses to look at the camera because they are then implicating the spectator in the system. In other words, you are looking in on a world that is unfolding before you. It's not looking at you. There are exceptions to this, but I think the exceptions prove the rule in most cases. And that taboo is very, very important because it allows you, again, this kind of risk-free position, slightly tinged with the illicit. It's in the dark, you're looking, you're not being looked at, which is part of the pleasure of going to the movies.
Could I interpose one other, since we're talking about movies, when we first started this whole idea of having the panel, one of the people that was brought up for discussion was Thomas Struth, who is the photographer who takes pictures of other people looking at aesthetic objects, which struck me, and then we discussed it because you said this didn't really fall into the classic category of
for my narrow definition.
For the narrow, but you are, the whole idea is having access to intimate moments, the moment of the spectator's eyes gazing upon something. And then it made me, for some reason, free associating, I kept thinking about accidents. When something happens, and this would fall more in the category of what you're talking about, if someone is hurt on the street and a crowd, now there are people that, now, for instance, I know people who run from that, they don't want to see it, and I know people, they want to see blood, they want to see the accident, they want to see, no matter how terrible it is, decapitation, the terrible thing happened in my neighborhood, and there were people that they wanted to see decapitation. They wanted to see this. So I think what I'm introducing here is, there may be even a sexual element that's kind of hidden, camouflaged within these two experiences, but they are sort of extra sexual elements of voyeurism, the aesthetic and the existential. I'm just proposing other categories of looking at it. And one last thing is that it occurs to me that it's transactional in these in the case of going to the lap dance or strip club or even the peep show. The peep show has so much in common with the confessional in some way. As far as I just can't help it. The person is there's something that I think the discussion hasn't. It seems to be power was one of the elements of the discussion, but it's a two-way street here. There's something going on in the excitation process, in the kind of divulging of secrets, and the listener. There's two people involved in these situations. In the strip club, it's more, but it's really two people, and there seems to be some sort of a transaction in voyeurism, even in the case of Rear Window.
Right. Let me stop you there. Katherine, is it transactional?
We'll see. I again still resist calling the strip club voyeuristic in the narrow pathological sense. So, but to talk about the relations of looking in there, I think that's what I was trying to reference earlier when I was talking about the gaze being more complex, in that the interactions especially that I was studying, were not peep shows where the dancer does not see the customer. This is where the dancer and the customer are interacting in a very close range. The dancer is looking back at the customer, and in fact, the look is the one way you can touch. Touching was policed by the clubs and by law enforcement. So the actual way of touching is through the eyes. That's the only way, is through that sort of reciprocal look. Dancers who didn't look customers in the eyes from the stage or during a lap dance or personal dance didn't make any money, right? So it's very much relational, and it's also relational in terms of other men seeing you desiring is a very important part of the whole experience. So that's different from a man also, again, going to a booth where he's anonymous. In a club, especially the kind of clubs that I was really interested in, the men are visible to all the other audience members, and that's an important part of the gendered aspect of that experience, as opposed to, it's linked up with the sexual and erotic, but it's also very gendered. Here I am, a man desiring a woman, and everyone can see that. So
there's also the performative quality where, let's say, lap dance in a large club, where that activity becomes voyeuristically appreciated and acknowledged by other people who may not be at all acknowledged by the two people who are going through the lap dance.
But there's an economics too, right? In other words, those other men see me spending money, they know I'm rich and successful. So there's a kind of male bonding going on as well, which you've talked about a lot in the book.
Definitely.
In the higher classier, as you call them, clubs, aren't those usually men and women come to them? It's not,
as couples?
yeah.
Occasionally, yeah. I think it's more and more common now. When I was first researching, it wasn't as common as it is today. More women are interested in seeing what happens in those spaces. So
do the women go more in a sense as with a research mindset, or are they being? It sounds. I don't mean it to be sort of humorous in a sense,
or to make sure that men don't enjoy too much.
Well, that's
or they're being brought with their partners because their partner wants their wife or girlfriend or whoever it is to be there with them for I'm not quite sure what, but
occasionally it is possible for a couple to go to the strip club, they both get aroused, and they go home and have sex. So that's why I don't like to call that voyeuristic, even though they go home. In other words, looking at something attractive, like a naked woman's body, is erotic. It doesn't make it pathologic.
But if a couple was practicing a voyeuristic act, let's say of seeing their neighbor across the way, which in New York is so easy, doing something sexual and was then aroused, how is that any different from going to a club?
If they had to keep doing that in order to be aroused to have sex, then I would think there's a problem.
It's okay once.
Once in a while.
Well, that is the classic Freudian criterion, of course, that he uses to differentiate between perversion, appellation contrôlée, the French would say, the true blue pervert, and the occasional experimental, fixation. That's the classic Freudian criterion. If you only can get aroused on the basis of fixated and compulsive kind of way using this particular object, then Freud would say, well, that's perversion, and that's what constitutes pathology. I'm not saying I agree with that, but that's the classic Freudian.
What about from the dancer's point of view? Is it enjoyable at all to capture the gaze of the voyeur, say, in the case it's talking about?
Depends what they look like.
I think I think that there is the fact that the dancers are not unsuspecting, right? So they're not it's not the same as looking into your neighbor's window. You know what you're doing when you go to work. You prepare your body so that the nudity that you reveal is very much a disguise. It's as much a disguise as clothing. So when you are actually revealing yourself is at different times than the customers may expect. So as far as whether or not it's pleasurable, I think that's something it's a question that people ask a lot. Is that my microphone?
Do you like your work?
I mean, the money is fantastic. I think that's definitely, there's a reward. You're also compensated. So you're not only unsuspecting and prepared, but you're compensated. Now, there's still an inequality there because it's their entertainment and your labor, right? So the disposable income that it takes to go and spend $500 on a dancer, there is still inequality there. It's all wrapped up with the other privileges. I think a lot of the work that was very celebratory on dancing, there was a whole line of work that was celebratory of the sex industry and stripping and saying the dancer has power and pleasure in this work is a little, it's again a little simplistic. Every interaction is different. Every night is different. There are times, just like with any job, that it would be enjoyable, and times when you would be at a disadvantage. So,
how did you get involved in this area in and of itself, the area of inquiry? How did you decide that you were interested in this very thing?
I was actually an anti-pornography feminist in undergrad, and so I was really interested in studying objectification of women and eating disorders and body image and all of that. But as my introductory project, I started interviewing women who made a living from their bodies, and I found that they had really different ideas about their bodies than the college students I had who had never actually, the college students who were my peers who had never sort of exposed themselves that directly to the gaze and actually attempted to make a living off their bodies. So I sort of worked my way in that way, interviewing them. My first project was to study the women, and I started working as a dancer, and I think within a week I'd figured out why the women do it, and became much more fascinated in why the men would go to these spaces.
In the week you found it was money.
Exactly. It was money. It was job flexibility. Just the pleasure of, I'd been waitress for a long time. It's a lot easier to drink champagne and dance and wear a pretty dress than be covered in ketchup all night. Those questions were relatively simple.
But none of these, so none of these women that you interviewed said that they actually enjoyed being looked at by men?
No, I think that's fine. I just think that's secondary. I think that, do you enjoy being looked at? I wouldn't say everyone because I don't like to generalize, but people enjoy being looked at in certain situations and not in others. Yeah. There are certainly some customers who might make you feel more exposed than others. There are some who might try to irritate you psychologically, or some who are compensating you more, and then the looking is more relational and more pleasurable. There's so many different factors that come into a live interaction. I don't think you could really just say the looking is pleasurable, being looked at is pleasurable or not.
Well, I guess I'm also asking the question because in order to get to the point where one can be a stripper, one has to go through a certain selection process, and making it through that process can make the woman think that she must be attractive enough to do this kind of job. So it's somehow a judgment about the aesthetics of the body within that context of the male gaze.
Mm-hmm. But
From
I'm
which
sure that there
I
are
think
very beautiful women who could never strip because it's a skill, actually. Exactly. It's a performance. And I think it's more comparable to acting.
Yeah.
And as you say, the nudity is a costume, in fact. It's something you put on. And I think the skill is, partly in the look, partly in, being looked at in a particular kind of way, and in the dialogue between you and the customer, which is a very important component of it. So,
you didn't say, for instance, I'm an anthropologist studying men looking at women when you
Actually, occasionally I did.
Did you really?
Yeah, I tried to be upfront. There are times that men didn't want that information. I was always honest. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I was just thinking about the question of the real and your discussion in the book of how one of the desires on the part of the men was for reality. So not having plastic surgery, being authentic, being a hometown girl and not, somebody, not a prostitute, in fact. It's a very interesting component of it, and it's, in a way, it's comparable to the realist cinema, where your desire is for the real. Mm-hmm. And all the while, it's a fiction, but you want to have some component of it be real.
That goes back to the idea of voyeurism, really, that you're wanting to observe something that you can contextualize as an extremely verifiable experience. That this could happen with the schoolgirl down the street or the neighbor's wife or whatever.
And I think I mean, I keep going back to medieval religion, but that was the real drama, is that you're seeing the real thing. I mean, when you see an image of a crucifix, that, I mean, it's a representation, but it's real. Mm-hmm. You know, it's as real as you can get without, you know, having been there, because it participates as an authentic sign.
Is that why public executions were so popular?
In part, I think I mean, there was actually, in the late Middle Ages, executions and all kinds of punishment became increasingly public. And perhaps in relation to the whole public performance of religion, it was happening at the same time in the 14th and 15th century. That's really an interesting thought. And it's certainly being used. It's something that was being used politically as a tool. I mean, you have a lot of control over people if you you can orchestrate this kind of pleasure that you were talking about. People want to see violence, and they want to see, you know, mayhem and decapitation and public executions. I mean, that for whatever reason, there's a perverse.
The relationship is so manifest. I mean, didn't they have these carti vulgari? The carts, people get up and once a year they would scream out the profanities, and then I can't help but think, when I've reread Chaucer fairly recently on a certain occasion, how utterly, you know, ribald, you know, it is. It's fantastic, the access they've had, you know, to the kinds of imagery that we don't usually associate with Christianity, the high point of Christianity.
Right. I mean, that one might think that it's contained, but it's very much a sort of spectator sport of spectacle. So,
I feel we can open it up to the audience here. We've discussed numerous aspects of looking in voyeurism. I'm sure that there are quite a few people in the audience who want to ask questions or make a comment. Please come to the microphone and tell us who you are, and then formulate your question or your comment.
Just quickly, I think one of the things that's been overlooked a little bit in this discussion, partially because we're talking about live strip clubs, is the fact that I would hazard to guess that more people than ever are looking at images of naked people because of the internet, and that the availability of images has probably created an exponential growth of people who are indulging in that behavior, because the stigma isn't attached, because you can do it in private. And then there's another corollary to that, which may be another roundtable, but all of the social networking websites have kind of propagated exhibitionism, which I think is in a way has a relationship to voyeurism. And I was just wondering what you thought about how the internet kind of encourages a behavior that is probably natural in a way, but maybe exacerbates it because of the availability, and also encourages the opposite.
Any thoughts on that, panelists?
It's a very safe place to look at naked people, to be extremely caught up in your voyeurism, whatever it may be, and to not at all fear the stigma. Though the only things you ever hear are, my children or my husband, found these pictures, and therefore my job or whatever is at jeopardy. But I think that's
Katherine?
Well, and as a comparison to the strip club research, I also interviewed people who preferred pornography, internet, print, or video, people who chose to go see other kinds of sex workers, dominatrixes, or escorts. And one of the interesting things, I think, is that the risk is managed at a level that remains exciting. So you were talking earlier about the risk of watching a film, or, some amount of risk is exciting. So that line between the safety and danger is really carefully managed by consumers of each type of erotic material.
Marianne, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think that the internet is really interesting to look at in this respect. And what fascinates me is the webcam sites. And this is a fairly old example, but Jenny Cam, for instance, someone who sets up a web camera in their bedroom or their apartment, and records 24 hours a day their life. and their life is accessible online. And what is the pleasure of watching that? You might think that it's boring to do that, but I think the pleasure has to do with the possibility of something contingent happening that hasn't been planned, something going wrong, or seeing some sex, or seeing something that wasn't planned ahead, something that's spontaneous, which I think it can be linked to sort of televisual representation of catastrophe also, with keeping the camera on a place during a hurricane, the anchor person sitting there in the wind. Why does the anchor person have to go and be in the midst of the hurricane? To show that it's there and that you might see a building fall on you. I mean, there's a kind of lust for contingency through representation, which is very interesting.
Right, okay.
So it's interesting because the media now gives us so many quick cuts. We don't see a long view at all.
Well, not in the coverage of catastrophe. That's what's really interesting. That's where you get real time. And real time technically defined as being, at the same time, the same place that something is happening, it's broadcast, and you are seeing it as it's happening. And you don't get very much editing at all. And sometimes you get no commercials, which is also extremely interesting. Commercial-free catastrophe coverage, because something might happen during the commercial.
Okay, let's move on to the next question.
Bruce Scleroux with the Forum for Movies in Mind and its journal Projections, a little PR. Bernardo Bertolucci, who's had a lot of experience with analysis, talks about looking at the viewfinder as the same as looking at a peephole. And one issue that we haven't talked about so far is looking at the primal scene. And he did a poetry collection at age 20 that won an award that was about in camera, from the linguistic connection. And and then there's Peeping. There are a couple of movies. Peeping Tom, which is about a voyeur photographer who had a knife in his camera and killed the women, and of course Kieślowski's a short film about love from the Decalogue. But the idea of the primal scene, I think, is a part of looking through some of the excitement and yet safety of looking through a window. So looking at mother, father, usually mother, in a home setting with the safety of not usually being seen. Someone commented about perversion being ubiquitous. Perversion is there in the beginning. This is going to sound a little technical, but I'm coming to a definition. Freud spoke of component sexual instincts in the three essays. So I would not say that perversion is ubiquitous or that children are perverse. They have exhibitionism, they have, sadomasochism. It's all there. And the task of development is to integrate, to consolidate all these partial instincts into true genitality. This is the classic theory. Fenichel, in I think the 1945 psychoanalysis of neuroses, had a definition that goes something like this for a perversion, and I think we need to. This is a way of drawing the line through the continuum. A preferred and habitual means of reaching maximum sexual excitement, usually orgasm, in a heterosexual relationship that's not involved with a relative. It leaves out a couple of things, like a woman who can only have an orgasm through cunnilingus. We would not usually give that label, and there's certainly an age generational factor. So it has to be preferred and habitual, and if it doesn't rise to that, it classically, psychoanalytically, doesn't give you the definition of perversion per se.
I'm not sure it was a question, but I think it was a comment rather than a question.
It was a lecture from the clinician.
I think it was a comment rather than a question, which shouldn't stop us from reflecting upon the comment. I mean, there's two aspects to what you said. I mean, the first point you made was about the way in which voyeurism had actually been integrated, recuperated, if you want, in the cinematic sphere by people like Bertolucci and the director of Peeping Tom, the name escapes me now.
Michael Powell.
Michael Powell. And the second point you made is about the definition of perversion. So I'm not sure whether the two are related, but perhaps they are. But I guess the question that also we addressed at some point is to what extent voyeurism should be pathologized as a perversion, or as we would now call it, a paraphilia. Okay. Does anyone want to comment on what the gentleman said? No? Okay. Let's move on.
My name's Elaine Pass. What kept popping up in my head like a pop-up video is Narcissus. Like this guy looked, what in perfect mirroring, So then after that, narcissism and borderline couples came to mind. So my question is for Katherine, Frank. When you worked in the different clubs, were most of the men more narcissistic, the overly entitled, looking at a woman, devaluing her perhaps, and wanting the perfection, to augment their insufficient self? And I'm just wondering about that, because after listening to this wonderful conversation with everybody, Narcissus just kept popping up in my brain, and I'm thinking, is this what you saw in your travels, a form of extreme narcissism, and are these guys so pathetic?
Well, I think that there is an idea that a customer would be somehow pathetic or a failure, right? That's one view of a sex industry customer in general. Another view is that they were interested in dominating women. So there's these kind of two polarized views of what the men are actually like. I titled the book G-Strings and Sympathy because I think when I became a dancer and realized how much talk was a part of these interactions, it wasn't as much about nudity, or certainly it's not about dancing. It's not as much about nudity or even looking as much as it was about talk and creating a certain kind of experience for them. Masculinity is not just empowering, but it's also damaging. There were a lot of times customers said they had no one to talk to in their life. They couldn't talk to their male friends about emotional things. They couldn't talk to their wife about their wife. They weren't allowed to have female friends who are better listeners. So they were using these women as, as ears as well as visions. But no, I wouldn't say that they were pathetic. I wouldn't want to say that they were pathetic, and I also wouldn't want to say that they were always dominating. Or
well,
I think that.
I don't think a borderline guy would go to a club. I would suspect. I would, not being there, maybe in my next life I'll do it like you did it, which is really courageous. This is really a form of narcissism in the extreme.
I tried not to use any clinical categories.
Yeah, can I just say why do you think that it's a form of narcissism there in the extreme? Because unlike Narcissus in the Greek myth, these men do not look at themselves to the point where they drown in their own self-love.
But I think
they look at an image that is actually quite different from themselves, and in which I think they try to capture, probably through the gaze, a form of desire, which they then see as something that can be objectifying or what. But so why do you say it's narcissistic?
In a form, you have to look at who's looking. Like a narcissistic man, when he gazes at the potential mate, is looking for somebody who will augment his, his grandiosity, and he usually picks a borderline lady as his couple. So when I'm thinking, if you need this perfect mirroring, forget about Narcissus then, like this perfect mirroring to augment a deficiency in yourself.
Well, I think you're making assumptions that is difficult to make, except on an individual level. talking to the person, interviewing the person, analyzing the person. You can't generalize that way. All sorts of people go to strip clubs, and to say they're all narcissistic wouldn't make sense.
I wouldn't say all, but I would just guess. Like if I had to guess.
If we take
Let's take a vote.
If we take narcissism to mean, if we take narcissism to mean eroticized self-love, right?
No, I'm saying the absence of self, and to try to fortify it by seeking the perfect woman, like the trophy wife, or
But see, that's a very important point, because most of them did have women in their lives. So the dancer is not the only woman in the life. The dancer, in some ways, becomes a third, right? So that she is important in terms of a relationship he already has with women outside of the clubs. So, I mean, perhaps, again, I'm not a clinician, so I don't know how I would come up with a diagnosis, but you would have to look, I would think, at the relationship they had with their wife or partner if you were going to try to diagnose narcissism. Because these interactions in the clubs are
You didn't ask your participants that question?
I asked them many questions about their wives. And it became a really important part of the analysis.
Next.
Thank you. Next question or comment.
Larry Cutler,
Hi, Larry.
radical retired. It says here, this panel will explore looking from the perspective of psychoanalysis, neuroscience, art, and film. Then Mr. Robbins mentioned something of taking pictures and looking for pleasure. Probably some kind of aesthetic pleasure. And I immediately thought of how the government, in terms of Iraq, doesn't allow certain pictures to be taken. You cannot see a lot of the things that are taking place in the war, whereas in the Vietnam War they did show more. And I'm wondering why you didn't bring in politics as another thing in terms of looking. And another thing is in terms of films with looking. What I see in terms of, say, not bringing in this Iraqi thing is exposure. Maybe the government or whatever not wanting to expose what's actually happening because of how people will feel when they actually see it, which will be opposed to what the government wants them to see or what the interest of what they want to do is. Mm-hmm. So anyway, now since I'm very interested in this, is that voyeurism? Mm-hmm. No. Mm-hmm. Right. But it's interesting that in this...
But if it gets you aroused, it may be.
It's interesting. It's interesting that it's from looking to voyeurism, but this has basically been about voyeurism, but there's a lot to look about looking too.
But my point was that looking is an important property of everything, of the animal kingdom, if you will, of certainly the vertebrate animal kingdom. Looking is important, and it's a property that we have from the day we are born. Little children cannot learn, cannot absorb the environment. They're constantly looking. And Dr. Scleroux mentioned primal sin. Well, part of the primal sin is the same thing, is a curiosity about what's happening behind closed doors. It is only, in my mind, voyeurism when this becomes the only compulsive means of attaining pleasure.
I'm not arguing with you.
Okay.
I just want to.
I think it's really important.
What he said was what set me going. Arousal. With the pleasure, you mentioned pleasure as you mentioned when you do your work, and you didn't mean it in a sexual manner, I don't think.
No, it was much more meant aesthetically. Now, where the aesthetic and the sensual and the sexual meet, those are obviously very blurry lines.
That's right.
But your point about the censorship, I think, is very important, and I think it's sort of like a different interpretation is definitely the other side of this, because our government is censoring our ability to see in the way that we're sort of, I don't know if I can quite make it, but definitely there's a relationship that the government is trying to say it's bad for you to see this, which is all about control of power, and then rather than having us being able to see women's bodies and the negative stigma going along with the government's trying to stigmatize our experience of looking.
And what's interesting, though, to go to the internet, while we can download or watch all the pornographic we want, we can also watch all the other stuff. And I think we're living in a country, personally, that is very much under the control of a lack of democracy in media. And we need to go outside, which is what the media, I mean, the internet allows us to go outside of.
Wow. They're going to get to that, too. And film, too.
Thank you very much. Let's move on.
Yes. To help settle the question of whether the predominance of male voyeurism, at least in our society, is biological or cultural, does anyone have any information about other societies, say primitive African tribes, or maybe even Roman and Greek? Was voyeurism always around, and how does it compare in other societies?
Sounds like a question for a cultural anthropologist.
In particular, how about other animals? Do other animals have voyeuristic experiences?
I mean, I think voyeurism itself is a cultural term if we're using it coming from psychoanalysis, right? So certainly people haven't categorized behaviors like that everywhere over time. And I mean, I think there are examples of different kinds of gendered looking in societies around the world. So different kinds of dances where women are the spectators or men are the spectators. I mean, I don't think that, certainly I come from a cultural half of cultural anthropology, but I don't even know if people in anthropology would say it was just cultural or biological anyway at this point. I think they would see those things as really interrelated from like the little children growing up in a given society. I mean, culture and biology are always interacting, so I don't think I can answer that.
I mean, the power.
How about monkeys?
No, it's powerful. It's but looking is a sign of aggression among most primates, and it tends to be. I don't know if it's gendered particularly, but it's certainly to stare for animals. To stare at your cat or your dog is going to get them to like bite you. I mean, but that's very much part of behavior.
Is it more
behavioral.
male animals or female animals, or the same?
As I understand it, it's more male. It's more
male
aggression.
In my mind,
what I've
biological.
In the societies where everybody is naked, there are no strip clubs.
But does everybody stare at each other?
Which doesn't mean that in those societies people would do things in order to attract the gaze. And you see that in the animal world as well. I mean, the importance of color, the importance of the parade, and within the unfolding of the sexual ritual, the visual dynamics is very important. Whether you want to call that voyeurism, well, that's a different matter. But
this reminds me of a very interesting film by Trinity Menha, which is called Reassemblage, and it's a film about a village in Africa, and there's a lot of breast nudity in the film, and it's a critique of the ethnographic film. It's a critique of how we visualize the other and the codes and conventions of documentary that produce a certain kind of look at the other that are usually associated with like National Geographic or whatever. And within the soundtrack of the film, which is Trinity Menha's own voice, she talks about seeing a man or listening to a man and his wife who had just left a National Geographic type film about primitive others, and as he walked out he said, "I have just seen some pornography tonight." And what he was referring to is toplessness. I mean, the fact that they didn't cover their breasts in that particular society. So it's very difficult for me, to see that as not a kind of cultural phenomenon. Obviously, breasts can be fetishized in one society and not in another.
Because then doesn't she say, my nudity does not reveal. This nudity does not reveal over and over as the fly lands on the.
Well, would we have voyeurism if women's sexuality were more greatly accepted or appreciated or allowed to be at the same level that male sexuality seems to be so much celebrated?
Actually, I think women are sexuality and men are the asexual, and that's...
So the voyeuristic gaze is in a sense an attempt to bring that into ourselves.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on.
Well, this is a good lead-in to really what I wanted to make a comment and an observation, and that is that the imagination, I guess, that this group really defines itself as being a place where ideas are talked about has, for me, taken voyeurism itself to a whole other level. I mean, it's layered it out to a place where it no longer has any meaning as voyeuristic the way we know it. For me, voyeurism is a failure of intimacy. And generally, in people I see clinically, when men who we are now calling porn addicts, or internet sex addicts, tend to be people, every one that I've ever seen, and men outside of the clinical settings say, are not intimate with their wives. I mean, it's a way to observe and to be aroused by somebody in a sterile, private place where there's no need to interact. And I'm thinking that this is really a big problem, but nobody has talked about how voyeurism really is, I think, a pathology, and how it really affects intimacy. The word intimacy, I don't think ever really even came up.
But in your experience of working with those people, is it that they have recourse to that type of voyeurism out of a fear of intimacy? Is it that they're seeking a place where they can safely and without any fear of being intimidated by the desire of the other, to put it in a Lacanian way, can express and experience enjoyment? Is that what is behind it?
Well, but I think it's the same thing. The fact is that they can do it that way, but they can't do it with an intimate other. At least that's what I've been doing working with people on for 26 years. And It comes up all the time. The work is to try and help people repair that. Obviously, I think it happens very, very young, and it's laid down in the family of origin. But it comes into practice in the family, in the couple. And so the work of therapy is helping people find those pathways and begin to stop having, a divide or a boundary between them and their partners.
Well, if you put the series together, the intimacy came up a lot in mating in captivity.
Oh, yes. And
50% of it was about intimacy.
But I'm just talking about in this one place, that part of voyeurism. I don't know what happened to it.
Well, again, I think that when I was saying earlier that you can't call men who use the sex industry or strip clubs, and more specifically, voyeurs, is also because there is a clinical sample that has problems with pornography or escorts or strip clubs, doesn't mean there's not a non-clinical population that also is able to be intimate and still access adult entertainment of some sort. And certainly the men, I did ask questions about therapy, I asked questions about relationships with their wives, and then that wasn't always, intimacy was something that they talked about quite a bit in the interviews, actually, with the dancers as well as with their wives. So,
I think we might be able to also say that certain structures or cultural structures have ways of deflecting intimacy or undoing intimacy or remaking intimacy for their own purposes. And it came up earlier that the whole picture of the confessional. I mean, is a confessional a way of removing intimacy from a relationship between an individual and a confessor by setting a screen between them and formalizing a relationship? So is that the same? I mean, do we have, and are people so afraid of intimacy that they gravitate toward the internet as ways of avoiding intimacy? I mean, I think we see that all the time, as of what you're talking about. So, I think intimacy is a real terror, and various cultural forms or the production of all these websites is a way of exploiting that fear. Yes.
I think in the arts, I curated an exhibit last year at Hunter College called Regarding Intimacy, and I was not interested in sexual expressions of intimacy, but much more in the sort of day-to-day interactions between parents and children, children and parents, friends, partners, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of my motivation was because of the alarm that I felt, in a sense, or in observing how much sexuality infuses our visual media, and as well as within the fine arts world, there's so much attention being put to in the gallery world, which is, in a sense, what drives everything, in the portrayal of intimate, physical, sexual, or sexualized interactions between people. So I found it very disturbing that there often is so little attention paid to, or things are not as much applauded when the imagery is not something that is more titillating, or it could be violent, it could be aggressive, definitely sexual. You know, sort of the whole range of these sort of extreme definitions of behavior or experience. You ask a very important question.
Herbert Kogan, retired analyst. What hasn't been mentioned is that I think the prince of all voyeurs, non-pathological, is the infant. And the gaze of the infant is certainly something that meets many of the criteria for voyeurism in the non-pathological sense. When the gaze is not, when it is not a transaction, then we get into the possibilities of pathology, and it's an interesting speculation whether the pathological voyeur later on is somebody who, for some reason, has suffered a failure of the transaction with the mother. That's one comment. The second comment that has not been mentioned at all, although we've talked a great deal about voyeurism, is that the voyeur often has a focus. The focus is not on necessarily the total naked body. The focus is often on genital or other parts of the body that specifically refer to a kind of origin of the pathology itself.
Any reflections, comments, panelists?
I just prefer the term curiosity to voyeurism in the infant and the child. I think voyeurism comes later. I think children and all adults have curiosity as a basic property.
Right.
It gets pathologized for other reasons later.
Right. Okay.
I guess I would think the gaze of the child is just anti-voyeuristic. I mean, because it's so free. There's no, you know, they're the ones who stare at you on the subway. It's okay, it's great, because they're allowed to. I mean, so, yeah, I don't see the voyeurism in the gaze of the child.
But in saying that, you're also saying that the child, precisely on account of being a child, is not being pathologized, that the pathology does not rest there in the gaze, but actually in the imposition of a pathologizing structure that captures that gaze and tries to, in a sense, domesticate it by putting it within a medicalized, pathologizing context. You know, the child gets away with it because it's a child. Mm-hmm. You know, the adult doesn't get away with it because the adult is supposed to have grown up and not do that anymore, and therefore we pathologize it. Right?
But to flip that around, to go back in a way to what this woman now sitting was saying, why aren't we allowed to stare? Mm-hmm. This city is phenomenal. There's 8 million beautiful people to look at, whether you are turned on by them or not. And as an artist, everything for me is about a layperson's definition of voyeurism.
And God knows how many people are looking at this at the moment.
Right. So later I can be the
object. We can't see them.
But later we can be the object of our own affection. But we could say what went wrong, that society does not allow for the adult gaze to be acceptable in a non-sexualized, non-pathological way.
Right.
We're constantly, especially in the larger cities, not allowed to look at each other.
Absolutely.
I just want to make 3 points. I wanted to follow up on the animal kingdom because usually it's the males who have to do the attractions, and so that, you know, male birds are definitely more beautiful than female birds, and preening it's all part of natural selection. So that's the answer, I think, to the animal kingdom. And then in terms of what defines voyeurism culturally, because that was brought up as well, it seems to me, say, in the Islamic religion, to, you know, looking at another naked woman is absolute voyeurism, punishable by, it's a crime. So that there's a cultural context there. But the other thing that was brought up much earlier in the conversation was about women wanting to get looked at and men don't want to get looked at, or women don't want to look at men. It seems to me that it's a very primitive instinct that men are looking for the best, again, natural selection type thing, where women, if a man is too good looking, women interpret it as he might be too indulging, self-absorbed, and he wouldn't be a good provider, he wouldn't be a good husband, and in fact, he'd probably wind up cheating because statistically, rich men, good-looking men, more powerful men tend to have more affairs. So, and the way you can sort of support that is among gay men, appearance is extremely important because that dynamic of finding a suitable parent is not in the equation, and yet they're gay men are very interested in how they look because they're trying to find mates for different reasons.
That's a good point. I mean, we didn't actually talk about how. We talked about the gendering of the gays, but I think sexual orientation, homosexuality, heterosexuality can also be brought into the equation, and I think it's a valid point that within the gay community, looking. The visual field, as it is expressed, for example, through sartorial elements, is very important, and somehow I often think serves a purpose of consolidating something about that community, which you wouldn't have in a heterosexual context. Okay.
Can I ask a question in relation to that?
Yes.
Get the feedback, because I know that you all screened Blow Up here.
Yes, last week. And there's a scene in Blow Up where he's going to just before he goes to the park, and I mean that's an immensely voyeuristic film, and he's about to walk into this antique store, and there are two gay men with lap dogs, their little dogs that they're with. Mm-hmm. At that moment, which it seems like a throwaway otherwise. I mean, it's unclear why that is there. And I don't know if that has anything to do with, I mean, he's clearly deflecting erotic pleasure through his camera lens, or channeling his erotic pleasure on the camera lens, and not in being involved with women. But I don't know if anybody had any thoughts on why that episode with the gay couple is there, and if
Marianne?
saw that. I haven't seen the film in a while, and what interests me about it is this desire to know and to blow the film up, more and more, so that its graininess obfuscates all knowledge. But I think that this is probably more in answer to the question that was asked from the audience or several of the questions maybe. It seems to me that homosexuality is a kind of demonstration of the fact that sexuality in human beings goes way beyond reproduction. I mean, it's just completely, in many, many ways, it's so much more than reproduction, which is why I'd be very hesitant to look to the animal kingdom, to find some kind of cause or determination of male versus female or whatever. I think that, and also it throws into doubt something that's been taken for granted here, which has to do with the sort of strict opposition between perversion and normalcy. And I realize that clinicians have to make a diagnosis and there have to be definitions, etc. But it seems to me that one of the most important things that Freud did at the outset of psychoanalysis was to collapse that opposition and to demonstrate that at some level and at some time, psychically, we are all perverts. Mm-hmm. And that sexuality is very diverse. Mm-hmm. And in fact, what characterizes sexuality, and desire perhaps, very Lacanian idea, is that it has no object, that it has no stable object. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very important in thinking about looking in voyeurism. Mm-hmm.
So I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the question that underpins the three essays on sexuality is not how does one become a pervert. It's how does one become normal.
Normal, yes.
You know, and Freud doesn't seem to understand how that would ever be possible.
Yes, that's why it's an amazing book.
Given the polymorphous perversity that he identifies in every human being.
It's by becoming neurotic.
That's right.
Neurotic, excuse
That's
me.
right. Neurotic.
And neurosis is the negative of the perversion.
And morose, probably.
Morose.
Yeah. Okay, we have...
Bruce, before you begin, I just want to ask, you're very smart. And a friend of mine named Andre Spears said, you can't end this whole voyeurism thing without mentioning Duchamp did some piece which would explicitly address voyeurism. Are you familiar with that? I mean,
is it the large glass?
Yeah.
Oh, étant donné. Right.
Yes, and what does anyone know what that, what the crux of that? What is it?
I think it's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art.
What is it exactly?
It's a kind of an installation that Duchamp made in secrecy for the last 20 years of his life, and he created, in fact, I find it very interesting because created a almost museum diorama where you go into the room and there's a wooden door. And there are two little holes, peepholes, in which you look through, and he set up a naked woman spread-legged out on the ground among twigs holding a gas lamp. And I think one of the most interesting things for me, I actually went and saw that. I went to school in Philadelphia. You had to go see it. It was if you were studying art and you were studying Duchamp or you cared anything about this kind of moment in artistic history, you had to see it. It is a non-reproducible. Interesting for Duchamp, who reproduced and had many reproducible artworks. This is a non-reproducible work of art because it's actually an experience. And I was just thinking when everyone was talking about this that we talk about pornography, we talk about a lot of images and how they're transported on the internet and so forth. But I'm wondering whether, because voyeurism is, again, not the objects or even the subjects, it's the experience.
That's
and
right.
therefore it's
right.
it's not concrete in that sense.
Right.
And that's why, in a sense, looking at the Duchamp is the experience of a voyeuristic act.
If I remember correctly, also, Haley, isn't it rather upsetting to look through it? That's what I remember my experience of seeing that piece. It was a bit disturbing.
You were surprised if you didn't know what it was going to be.
I went there with an art history class, and my professor didn't even tell us that the Duchamp collection was there. So, but in a way, that's a surprise similar to maybe the stigma of the voyeuristic act. As a pathological.
The secrecy was so intrinsic to it because you are looking into a world that he created, but he also created that whole world in secret. He supposedly was only playing chess and not making art, so that there's a surprise element and a secrecy element as well. So I think that.
And is that the only copy of that is in Philadelphia?
Yeah, that's right.
Francis, your question led to a series of very free associations. When you said Duchamp, for some reason I thought of the famous urinal and had the fantasy of a urinal with a mirror. And this leads it just a vehicle to lead into the talking about narcissism and going to strip clubs. Well, I have to have one other aside. I once heard that someone walked out of a men's room and John Wayne was literally in the next urinal, and he walked out saying, "I've seen it. I've seen him." Quoted by another analyst. Okay, not to defend the position that people who go to strip clubs are particularly narcissistic. There is a distinction that Freud made in one of his early papers on love between two kinds of object choice, of person choice. Analytic, which really is not analytic but dependent, and the other is called a narcissistic object choice, which doesn't necessarily mean that one has pathological narcissism. It was simply the idea that one seeks in a partner what one feels either really deficient in or just aspires to be, like people who marry writers, and I know about this personally because you can't write fiction, to make up for something that you would like to be able to do. So from that point of view, it reminds me of Janet Malcolm's The Impossible Profession, there was a young analyst or a candidate named Dr. Green. Dr. Green's fantasy was to be a beautiful woman. He was not gay, he was not transsexual, so he would be looked at because he wasn't a very attractive man. So from that point of view, from that narcissistic object choice point of view, you could say that they were looking for, to be connected to a beautiful woman. One last thought. Following the idea of safety and the voyeur, this isn't well thought out, but one reason to be watching at a distance, or even in a strip club where a woman might be appearing to be excited, but not genuinely excited, is the fear of castration. If you have a distance, and so that you're not confronted with an excited, vulnerable woman, you're not confronted with the female genitals in an excited state, which can be overwhelming. And of course, the origin of Freud's basic theory on perversion is that essentially all clear-cut perversions boil down to castration anxiety. And because of the castration anxiety, you go back to an early fixation, which could be voyeuristic, it could be sadomasochistic, and that's what leads to it. So I wouldn't say that there's perversion in all of us. I think we need to, and the fact that someone gets excited by looking does not make them perverse in any sense. It is normal. It's only if it's preferred and habitual.
Sure.
End of lecture.
Thanks for that. We need to move on.
Quick question, Steve Rosenthal, media analyst. Do you feel that there's part of the voyeuristic aspect of someone being in the peeping Tom category is a form of arousal that could be climatic psychologically, that the person wants to get caught looking?
There is a component of punishment, which is the other side of the anxiety that leads to it, usually present, yes.
And the other thing is, from an anti-voyeuristic point of view, when the world at large realizes that their inability to be voyeuristic and observe the outrageous financial risks that companies have supposedly taken, and we are where we are now, who knows what's going to happen next week, you think that people are going to become much more desirous of a more transparent society as opposed to the kind of society that we've been living in, a la the limited photo access in Iraq? I mean, you think there's going to be like almost a voyeuristic kind of revolution saying no more. In other words, my feeling is.
What do you think? What do you think?
I think absolutely. I mean, I feel that the most outrageous aspect of our society is that what's happening right now in the last 30 days was auditioned with Enron at the very beginning of Bush's administration, where the two phrases, public company and off-balance sheet transaction, is turn around, I just stole your bracelet, it wasn't me, kind of a thing. And I just think, I think that that's a psychological trend that's going to be, certainly if I have anything to do about it, it's going to happen, but that's something that I'd be just curious to hear from an emotional point of view, especially, people who work with patients or somebody like yourself who's the head of an august organization that studies social sciences. I think the phrase, and it's oversimplifying it, people are pissed, has never, I mean, I don't even think they realize it yet.
I think that pissed as in saturated.
No. I mean pissed
angry.
As in
pissed as in angry. Right.
And in that process,
we say pissed off.
And in that process, there may be more people getting pissed. I mean, I just think that alcohol
and going to strip clubs. I think you have a very interesting question. That's food for thought. I think the moment that capital and credit are thought enough for the general public to start consuming again, they will start to forget. And I think the only change that I can really believe in is that we can slowly initiate a major reversal. but I think people are so intricately caught up with the intimate experience of consumption that it really takes, in a way, a psychological approach to what it means to consume and the pleasure that's derived from that as a way to maintain distance from the reality that we live in.
Well, that's true. But the other thing I think you might want to look at is, as someone once said in a famous movie, just he was about to kill somebody, and the guy said, "How come? I always did this before." And the guy said, "This time it's different." So.
All right. One final comment or question. Yeah.
I want to add to a comment that was made earlier about the infant gaze. And in developmental psychology, it's actually the return gaze or the gaze of the parental gaze is very important for healthy development of the child, whatever that is. And I'd like to, if the panel can comment about the validation that might exist in voyeurism, in all the continuum of its behavioral expression, how it's a validation for the self.
Sorry, how voyeurism is a validation?
A validation on the self. And also the return gaze. So it's not just the infant gaze that is important, it's the parental gaze. It's the mother or the father gaze at the child for him to or her to develop healthy, to have a healthy development. So how might that relate to?
From the Romanian children in the orphanage, it's clear that if there isn't the looking and the return of the gaze, and if there isn't the touching, the children grow up having a lot of problems.
So there is validation in that gaze. So I'm just curious what kind of validation exists in the act of voyeurism or looking, and also in the return gaze that a stripper might give to, or even when you once is walking in the street and just get an occasional gaze from someone that has validation in it. So that exists in a whole.
I'm not sure what you mean by validation. You see, I mean, do you mean that in attracting the gaze, one can actually feel consolidated in one's own existence?
Excited? Yes.
Well, maybe, but that can generate all kinds of affects and emotions. I mean, Lacan said the gaze is an object of desire, right? One of the objects of desire. Now, in being confronted with the gaze, one can feel consolidated in one's existence, but one can also feel intense anxiety, precisely because one does not know what one is for that gaze. So the gaze is objectifying, but raises all kinds of issues as to the desire of the other who is situated behind that gaze.
But that's when you consider the other as more important than you. But if you look at it from your own, I know for myself, if I walk in the street and I maybe especially dress nicely or in any whatever, and somebody will just give a nice, interested gaze that will validate my effort this morning.
Does it validate the stripper's self?
I think the answer was given by you earlier on when you said that if a stripper is not looking back, she's not successful.
Right. Definitely. I think there's another issue of recognition as well. I mean, so maybe I'm just using different terminology. I would talk about recognition instead of validation, but there are times when a dancer wants to be recognized as an object only, right, or doesn't want to be recognized for her subjectivity, and that would be a type of hiding behind the nudity. When the lack of recognition is pleasurable or empowering. This person doesn't know who I am or what I am. And the same for a customer. He may be playing a role of some kind of big spender or really attractive man. These might be the fantasies running through his head. There may be other times when he wants to be recognized as someone who hurts or someone who's involved in a relationship. And so the relations go beyond just the gazing, but into the talking and the exchange of information. I mean, it could happen in just a look, but I think with a parent and child, it's happening in terms of an ongoing relationship as well. I mean, a lot of times, the customers for whom this is an important experience, they develop ongoing relationships with dancers and return to see the same one weekly, monthly, bi-monthly, whatever it might be, whatever they can afford. But the recognition happens within that ongoing relationship.
So there's no recognition in just an occasional customer that just walked in, and there is, for whatever reason, some interaction that might create validation, not just for him,
there might
but
be.
for...
There certainly might be. I think they're paying for that to happen, and that would be an ideal situation, right, where they get the ego boost, they get the recognition, the validation. Certainly that was one of the spoken motivations, right? It doesn't. It's not always successful.
That's the fantasy, that you walk in and suddenly you are so special.
Right.
But I wonder. Oh, I have one more question. No, but that's the male fantasy. But I wonder.
I think I need to stop you all here. I think we've reached the end of this afternoon's roundtable. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their contributions, and I'd also like to thank Philoctetes, Francis, and Ed for making this happen, bringing us together. Apparently the books are outside. I hope you didn't just enjoy looking at us. I hope you enjoyed listening to us. And there you go. Thank you very much for your attention.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philoctetes events is available at philoctetes.org.